Official field reports. Unedited camera footage. Pure justice. You are watching Bodycam incident reports.
Open the door and hand me the bag. Now.
The store security just cleared me. False alarm.
I don't care. Hand over the property or you're going in cuffs.
Read it. But I do not consent to a search.
Friday night, 8:45 p.m. The harsh white glare of the high-end Whole Foods grocery store entrance pushed back the humid, overlapping shadows of the autumn evening. Inside, the store was entering its slow, closing shift rhythm. A single teenage cashier at Register 4 leaned against her counter, methodically scanning the final few items for a woman in a business suit. The store security guard, an older man with a faded navy tattoo, was already running the floor buffer near the meat department. Terrell Brooks was exhausted. His posture, usually rigid and controlled, was slumped under the weight of a 70-hour work week. He had traded his tailored wool suits for a faded gray oversized hoodie, baggy sweatpants, and a pair of scuffed running shoes. In his arms, he carried a single, heavy brown paper shopping bag. It wasn't a tactical bag or a backpack capable of concealing anything. It was a generic, easily crushed paper container holding $70 worth of upscale produce, a prime cut of ribeye, and a single, heavy glass jar of imported marinara sauce. He walked toward the exit with the slow, deliberate pace of a man ready for the quiet of his own home. He was visually invisible, just another middle-aged man in comfortable, undistinguished clothes grabbing dinner after a long day. As his foot hit the sensor for the automatic glass exit doors, the quiet environment was violently violated. A piercing, high-pitched beep, beep, beep of the electronic article surveillance pedestals erupted. The anti-theft gates pulsed with red warning lights. Terrell stopped immediately. He didn't run. He didn't look panicked. He didn't look over his shoulder for a police officer. Instead, he simply turned 180 degrees back toward the checkout lanes. Behind Register 4, the young cashier's eyes widened with an apology. She picked up a handheld magnetic scanner from her counter and made a helpless, "I missed one" gesture toward the older guard. The security guard didn't bother to move from the customer service desk. He had watched Terrell pay. He smiled tiredly, making direct eye contact with Terrell, and made a single, definitive, go-ahead wave with his hand. "It's okay, man," the guard called out across the 30-foot gap. "Cashier just forgot the security sticker on the ribeye. False alarm. Have a good night." The transaction was complete. The store's asset protection had cleared him. Terrell didn't ask for a manager or demand an apology. He just gave the guard a brief nod of acknowledgement, shifted the heavy weight of the paper bag against his chest, and walked directly through the flashing pedestals. The sliding glass doors parted, hitting him with a blast of cold autumn air. Before we see how a simple false alarm turns into a federal civil rights lawsuit, drop a like, hit subscribe, and let me know, down in the comments, what city are you watching this from? Terrell stepped onto the concrete walkway of the open-air shopping complex. Standing exactly 10 feet away from the glass vestibule, illuminated by the harsh white glow of the store's exterior LED lights, was Officer Ryan Schmidt. Schmidt stood with his thumbs hooked behind his heavy black leather duty belt, his posture wide, taking up space on the concrete. His eyes were locked dead center on Terrell Brooks. He didn't glance through the glass at the checkout lanes. He didn't look for the security guard. He didn't ask what had happened inside. He heard the high-pitched squeal of the anti-theft gates, and he saw a black man in a baggy gray hoodie carrying a bag. For Officer Schmidt, the context of the store didn't matter. The beep of the sensors was all the justification he needed to close the distance. He took a single, tactical half-step forward, transforming from a patrolman into a physical barrier. "Hold it right there," Schmidt commanded, his voice cutting sharply through the cold air. "I need to see that receipt. Put the bag on the ground. Now." Terrell Brooks did not drop the bag. The physical momentum of his exit halted abruptly on the brushed concrete walkway. The sliding glass doors hummed shut behind him, completely cutting off the ambient noise of the store's soft jazz and the rhythmic beeping of the cash registers. A deliberate 6-foot buffer remained between the toes of Terrell's scuffed gray running shoes and the polished black leather of Officer Ryan Schmidt's duty boots. Terrell didn't flinch. He held the heavy brown paper bag securely against his chest with both arms. Through the thick paper, he could feel the cold, hard curve of the glass marinara jar pressing into his left forearm, anchoring the weight of the groceries. His physical posture remained completely neutral. "Good evening, officer," Terrell said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone. It carried no tremor, no spike of adrenaline, and absolutely none of the rapid-fire, nervous cadence of a man caught in a lie. It was the calm, measured voice of a man completely comfortable in his own skin, even wearing a faded, oversized hoodie. "I just paid for these groceries," Terrell continued smoothly. The alarm was triggered by a deactivated magnetic sticker on the meat. The security guard inside just cleared me to leave. Terrell made a slow, deliberate gesture with his chin back toward the brightly lit interior of the grocery store. Through the thick, clean glass of the vestibule, the older security guard was still clearly visible, slowly pushing a yellow floor buffer down aisle 1. Schmidt didn't look past Terrell's shoulder. He didn't turn his head a single inch to look through the glass. His eyes, shadowed beneath the short brim of his dark uniform cap, remained locked dead center on the faded logo printed on the front of Terrell's hoodie. "I didn't ask you for an explanation," Schmidt snapped. The words were sharp, carrying the unyielding edge of street-level command presence. He closed the gap by one heavy step. The thick rubber soles of his tactical boots scraped loudly against the cold aggregate concrete. The leather of his duty belt creaked sharply as his weight shifted forward. "I said, put the bag down and hand me your receipt," Schmidt commanded, his volume rising. "Now, you're suspected of shoplifting." Terrell did not bend his knees. He didn't lower his arms. Instead, he tightened his grip on the rolled upper edge of the heavy paper bag. The thick brown paper crinkled loudly in the cold air, a sharp, unmistakable physical sound of resistance. He pulled the groceries a fraction of an inch closer to his chest, securely locking his forearms around the bottom. "The guard inside just watched me pay for this," Terrell replied, his tone remaining flat, almost bored. His dark eyes never left the officer's face. "Go tap on the glass and ask him. I'm going home." Schmidt's jaw tightened visibly beneath his thin, meticulously trimmed beard. His shoulders squared off, his uniform pulling tight across his chest. His right hand dropped slowly from the center buckle of his heavy duty belt. The thick black tactical glove hovered deliberately just inches above the hardened polymer holsters, housing his baton and taser. The portable radio clipped to his left shoulder hissed briefly with static. "Are you refusing a lawful order?" Schmidt demanded. His voice was no longer a snap. It was a booming, theatrical shout that echoed off the brick facade of the shopping center. It was a phrase delivered with extreme volume, specifically designed to be picked up clearly by the microphone of his chest-mounted Axon body camera. "I am refusing an unlawful search," Terrell stated. The words were perfectly enunciated, delivered with the cold precision of a scalpel. The air between them instantly went dead. Schmidt's entire body tensed, his weight shifting aggressively onto the balls of his feet. The muscles in his forearms flexed tight against the dark sleeves of his uniform. The kinetic shift was absolute and undeniable. The officer was less than a second away from launching forward to physically rip the paper bag from Terrell's chest. Terrell saw the micro-expression. He saw the dangerous, immediate twitch in the officer's right shoulder. Before Schmidt could close the final 3 feet of concrete, Terrell took a single, slow step backward. Keeping his eyes locked dead on the officer's face, the heel of his running shoe crossed the invisible threshold of the motion sensors. Behind him, the automatic sliding glass doors hissed sharply, cracking open an inch. The motion sensors above the store's entrance caught the movement of Terrell's scuffed gray shoe. The heavy dual-pane automatic sliding glass doors hissed sharply, parting like a mechanical curtain and hitting the back of Terrell's hoodie with a blast of warm, climate-controlled air. He didn't turn around. He didn't run. Keeping his dark, impassive eyes locked dead on Officer Schmidt's flaring posture, Terrell took one calculated, fluid step backward into the brightly lit vestibule. The moment his body cleared the threshold, he stopped. He was now standing precisely 12 inches inside the store's entryway, bathed in the sterile white glare of the interior LEDs. Schmidt lunged forward on instinct, his heavy black boots stomping onto the motion sensor mat, his right hand gripping the textured polymer handle of his holstered taser. "Step back outside," Schmidt roared, his volume instantly maxing out the audio limiters on his chest-mounted camera. "You are not free to leave." "I am not leaving, officer," Terrell replied. His voice was no longer flat. It had sharpened into the distinct, commanding resonance of a man accustomed to silencing crowded rooms with a single sentence. "You demanded to verify my purchases. I am complying with that specific demand." Terrell didn't loosen his left arm's grip on the heavy brown paper bag, still cradling the groceries securely against his chest. Slowly, deliberately, raising his right hand where Schmidt could clearly see his empty fingers, Terrell reached into the front kangaroo pocket of his faded gray hoodie. Schmidt's entire body went rigid. His thumb slammed down on the retention hood of his taser, the mechanical click loud and sharp in the cold air. "Keep your hands where I can see them!" Schmidt screamed, his posture aggressively bladed toward the doorway. Terrell didn't flinch at the threat of the weapon. His hand emerged from the pocket holding a long, crumpled strip of thermal receipt paper. He didn't extend it outward. He didn't offer it to the officer's gloved hand. With slow, exaggerated precision, Terrell stepped forward until the toe of his shoe touched the metal track of the sliding doors. He raised his right arm, pressed the long white receipt flat against the inside of the thick safety glass, and held it there, perfectly still. The itemized list of his groceries, the time stamp of 8:44 p.m., and the bold print of the credit card approval code were instantly framed like a document in a museum case, separated from the officer by a half-inch of transparent, impenetrable glass. "Here is my receipt, Officer Schmidt," Terrell stated, his voice completely steady through the glass. "You have visual confirmation of my transaction. You may read every line item, but I am not transferring physical possession of my property to you, and I explicitly do not consent to a search of this bag." Schmidt stared at the white paper pressed against the glass. He didn't read the timestamp. He didn't check the items against the bag. A dark, violent flush crept up Schmidt's neck, visible above the collar of his dark uniform. His jaw worked furiously. He didn't see a citizen exercising a perfectly legal, non-violent assertion of their rights. He saw a man in a cheap hoodie publicly outmaneuvering him in front of the handful of shoppers now watching from the parking lot. "You think you're smart?" Schmidt breathed, his voice dropping an octave, no longer performing for the body cam. Schmidt didn't wait for an answer. He took a violent half-step forward and slammed his heavy gloved palm hard against the outside of the glass door, right over where Terrell's hand pinned the receipt. Schmidt's heavy black-gloved palm hit the reinforced safety glass with a violent, flat impact, pressing directly over the crumpled thermal receipt. The automatic doors instantly slid open, reacting to the officer's sudden proximity. The physical barrier between them vanished in a rush of cold autumn air. Schmidt stepped heavily over the metal track, invading Terrell's space. He didn't reach for the receipt. He didn't ask for the bag again. "Stop resisting!" Schmidt bellowed. With a sweeping downward strike of his left forearm, Schmidt violently swatted the heavy paper bag cradled against Terrell's chest. The thick paper tore instantly. The $70 worth of groceries spilled out in a chaotic cascade, but the only thing that mattered was the heavy glass jar of imported marinara sauce hitting the concrete. It exploded with a sharp, concussive crack that echoed across the empty parking lot. A wide pool of thick, dark red sauce splattered outward, painting the gray aggregate concrete in a violent, crimson spread. As the weight of the bag vanished, Terrell's left arm dropped instinctively. Schmidt capitalized on the microsecond of movement. "Get on the ground!" Before Terrell could process the shattered glass at his feet, Schmidt lunged. He drove his right shoulder hard into Terrell's chest, wrapping both arms around the man's torso. Simultaneously, the officer violently hooked Terrell's left ankle with his heavy black boot in a brutal tactical leg sweep. Terrell was 45 years old. He had no chance to brace. His feet were swept completely out from under him. He landed with sickening, heavy force. His chest and the right side of his face slammed directly into the center of the shattered marinara jar. The thick blood-red sauce instantly soaked into the faded gray fabric of his hoodie. Sharp, jagged fragments of broken glass bit through the cotton and scratched a deep laceration across his cheekbone. Genuine warm blood immediately began to mix with the crushed tomatoes pooling on the cold pavement. Schmidt dropped his entire 200-pound armored weight directly onto Terrell's upper back. A heavy, hardened knee drove viciously between Terrell's shoulder blades, pinning him flush against the wet concrete. The remaining air was violently forced from Terrell's lungs in a sharp, involuntary grunt. "Give me your hands!" Schmidt screamed, his voice raw and echoing off the brick facade. Terrell didn't struggle. He didn't tense his arms. He went completely limp, turning his head slightly to the side to avoid grinding his eye into a larger shard of glass. He offered his wrists backward in a deliberate act of total physical submission. Schmidt grabbed Terrell's left wrist, violently wrenching it up toward the shoulder joint. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs bit into Terrell's skin. The ratcheting mechanism locked tight over the wrist bone. Schmidt grabbed the right arm, yanking it back to meet the left. The second cuff snapped shut. The violence ended as abruptly as it began. The only sounds left were the heavy, adrenaline-fueled panting of Officer Schmidt and the distant squeak of the security guard's floor buffer inside the brightly lit store. Terrell lay motionless on the freezing concrete, his face pressed into the mixture of cold sauce and his own blood, his hands bound tightly behind his back. "Get up," Schmidt ordered. His chest heaved against his tactical vest. He didn't wait for Terrell to find his footing on the slippery concrete. The officer grabbed the short steel chain linking the handcuffs and hauled Terrell upward with a violent jerk that strained the shoulder sockets. Terrell stumbled to his feet, fighting for balance with his arms locked behind his back. The thick mixture of marinara and fresh blood from his cheekbone dripped heavily from his ruined gray hoodie, leaving a dark, wet trail across the asphalt. Schmidt spun him around, gripping his bicep with a heavy gloved hand. "Walk," Schmidt commanded, shoving Terrell forward toward the idling black and white patrol cruiser 20 yards away. The shattering glass and shouted commands had drawn an audience. A few late-night shoppers stood frozen near the cart return. The pale glow of their raised smartphones reflected off their faces as they recorded the dark, wet mess covering Terrell's chest. Schmidt saw the camera lenses. He immediately squared his shoulders, shoving Terrell forward with exaggerated, deliberate force. "Back away," Schmidt barked across the parking lot, his voice booming specifically for the amateur footage. "Apprehension for shoplifting and resisting arrest. Clear the area." Terrell ignored the bystanders and the agonizing bite of the steel cuffs on his wrist bones. He didn't fight the officer's shoves. Despite the ruined clothes and the public humiliation of the perp walk, he moved with a rigid, perfectly straight spine, his dark eyes locked dead ahead on the cruiser's flashing light bar. Schmidt marched him to the rear of the vehicle, grabbed the back of the soaked hoodie, and forced Terrell downward into the hard, molded plastic seat of the holding cage. The heavy metal door slammed shut, sealing Terrell inside the dark interior. Outside, Schmidt turned his back to the cruiser. He hooked his thumbs behind his duty belt, raised his chin toward the teenagers recording from the sidewalk, and slowly adjusted the collar of his uniform. The electronic lock on the heavy steel door of the 4th Precinct clicked open, buzzing with a sharp, industrial tone. Officer Schmidt hauled Terrell Brooks inside by the triceps. The climate-controlled air of the booking area hit them instantly, freezing the wet, soaked fabric of Terrell's gray hoodie against his chest. The holding pen was a stark, aggressively lit concrete box. It smelled faintly of ammonia and stale sweat. 3 other individuals sat silently on the long metal bench bolted to the far wall. They all turned their heads as the heavy door slammed shut. Schmidt marched his prisoner directly toward the elevated wooden booking desk. He didn't release his grip on the cuffs until Terrell's hips bumped against the front of the counter. Behind the thick, scratch-resistant plexiglass sat Sergeant Miller. He was a 20-year veteran with a thick gray mustache and tired eyes. He was halfway through a cold cup of coffee, his fingers resting lazily on the keyboard of the precinct's main intake terminal. Miller looked up. He took in the faded, baggy sweatpants, the scuffed running shoes, and the dark, wet red mess covering the right half of Terrell's chest and face. The laceration on Terrell's cheekbone had stopped bleeding, but the coagulated mixture of blood and crushed tomatoes looked like the aftermath of a severe domestic assault. "Rough night, Schmidt?" Miller asked casually, setting his coffee down. "Just another runner," Schmidt said, his chest still slightly puffed out beneath his vest. He unclipped a clear plastic evidence bag from his belt and tossed it onto the metal pass-through tray beneath the glass. Inside was the crumpled Whole Foods receipt Terrell had pressed to the door. Shoplifting at the organic place on 5th. Suspect became non-compliant. Active physical resistance during a lawful investigatory detention. I had to take him to the ground. Miller didn't blink at the description of violence. He pulled the evidence bag through the slot and glanced at the receipt. Then his eyes drifted back to the quiet, bleeding man standing in front of him. Terrell stood perfectly still. The heavy steel handcuffs remained locked tightly behind his back, forcing his shoulders into an unnatural, painful arch. He didn't lean against the counter for support. He didn't complain about the cold air biting into his wet skin. He simply stared through the plexiglass, his dark eyes locked onto the glowing monitor of the intake computer. "All right," Miller sighed, cracking his knuckles and pulling up a blank arrest profile on the screen. He looked directly at Terrell. "Let's get this over with. I need your full legal name, date of birth, and current home address." Terrell didn't answer immediately. He let the silence hang in the cold, sterile air of the precinct for exactly 3 seconds. "My name is Terrell Brooks," he said finally. His deep baritone voice was perfectly steady, echoing slightly off the concrete walls of the holding pen. "Date of birth is August 14th, 1980. Miller's fingers began clacking rhythmically against the keyboard, entering the data into the state's Central Criminal Justice Database. "Occupation?" Miller asked mechanically, his eyes still glued to the glowing screen as the system began its search. "Occupation?" Sergeant Miller repeated, his thick fingers hovering over the grease-stained keyboard. Terrell didn't break eye contact through the scratch-resistant plexiglass. "I am currently employed by the state of California," Terrell said. The deep resonance of his voice was completely devoid of anger or panic. Miller grunted softly, typing the letters into the occupation field. "State worker. Got it. Stand by." He hit the enter key with a loud plastic clack. The state's Central Criminal Justice Database, tied directly to the Department of Motor Vehicles, the FBI's NCIC, and the State Employee Registry, began its cross-reference. The spinning hourglass icon flickered on the monitor for exactly 2 seconds. Then, the screen didn't just load a profile, it flashed. A bright, solid red banner instantly dominated the top third of Miller's monitor. It was a high-level administrative lock, a digital safeguard designed to prevent unauthorized access or accidental release of sensitive public officials. The text within the red banner was stark white, bold, and entirely unmistakable. Restricted file, Judicial Officer, Honorable Terrell Brooks, Presiding Judge, 4th District Superior Court. Sergeant Miller's hands stopped moving. The rhythmic clacking of the keyboard died instantly in the cold, ammonia-scented air of the booking area. He didn't speak. He simply stared at the glowing monitor. He read the name. He looked at the high-definition DMV photograph of a clean-shaven man in a tailored black judicial robe. Then he slowly, mechanically raised his tired eyes to look through the thick plexiglass at the man standing in front of him. The man in the faded baggy sweatpants. The man with the deep, jagged laceration across his cheekbone. The man whose chest was heavily soaked in a dark, wet mixture of crushed organic tomatoes and his own blood, currently locked in cold steel handcuffs by one of Miller's own patrolmen. The color drained entirely from Sergeant Miller's face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. "Sergeant?" Officer Schmidt asked. He shifted his weight, his thumbs still hooked aggressively behind his heavy duty belt. He frowned, annoyed by the sudden dead silence. "What's the holdup? Print the intake sheet. I have paperwork to file on this guy." Miller didn't look at Schmidt. He didn't blink. He reached under the heavy wooden desk with a trembling hand and hit the silent internal panic button that immediately summoned the precinct captain. Only then did Miller turn his head. He looked at Schmidt not as a fellow officer, but as a man who had just knowingly walked off a cliff. "Schmidt," Miller said. His voice was a hoarse, unrecognizable whisper that barely carried through the speaker grate in the glass. "Take the handcuffs off." Schmidt laughed. It was a short, sharp bark of pure confusion. "Excuse me?" The guy actively resisted a lawful detent. "I said take the handcuffs off him right now," Miller roared. The sudden, violent explosion of volume from the 20-year veteran shattered the quiet of the holding pen. The 3 other prisoners on the metal bench jumped. Schmidt flinched backward, his hand dropping defensively to his belt. He stared at the sergeant, completely lost. "Take them off," Miller repeated, his voice dropping back to a terrifyingly quiet, trembling rasp. He pointed a single shaking finger through the glass directly at Terrell's ruined, blood-stained hoodie. "You just battered the sitting Superior Court judge of this district." The hum of the precinct's air conditioning suddenly sounded like a jet engine. Schmidt turned his head slowly. The aggressive street-level command presence evaporated from his posture instantly. He looked at the quiet, bleeding man standing in front of the desk. Terrell Brooks did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply stood perfectly still in the cold air, waiting for the heavy steel biting into his wrists to be unlocked. The heavy oak door of the precinct captain's office clicked shut, sealing out the hum of the booking area. The room was aggressively air-conditioned, smelling faintly of lemon polish and stale coffee. Terrell Brooks did not sit down. He stood perfectly straight in the center of the plush, beige carpet. The thick, dark red mixture of crushed organic tomatoes and his own blood had begun to dry into stiff, dark flakes across the front of his ruined gray hoodie. The deep laceration on his cheekbone was a raw, jagged line of torn flesh. He looked like the victim of a violent street mugging, but his posture was the rigid, unyielding stance of a man presiding over a capital murder trial. His hands were free. The heavy steel handcuffs had left deep, red indentations encircling both his wrists. Captain Harris stood rigidly behind his wide mahogany desk. He was a 25-year veteran, a man usually defined by his aggressive command presence. Right now, his face was the color of old ash. He was staring at the blood dripping slowly onto his expensive carpet, his jaw locked tight. Officer Schmidt stood to the right of the desk, his back pressed almost entirely against the wood-paneled wall. The aggressive street-level swagger he had carried across the Whole Foods parking lot was completely gone. His dark tactical uniform suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for him. He was breathing shallowly, his eyes darting frantically between the captain and the quiet, bleeding man in the center of the room. "Your Honor," Captain Harris began, his voice tight, carefully stripped of any defensive edge. "I cannot express how deeply—" "You don't need to express anything, Captain," Terrell interrupted. His deep baritone voice was perfectly calm, echoing slightly off the polished wood walls. It wasn't a shout. It was a cold, surgical strike. "Your patrolman requires the floor." Terrell turned his head slightly, his dark eyes locking onto Officer Schmidt. Schmidt swallowed hard. The thick black leather of his duty belt creaked as he shifted his weight. "Judge Brooks," Schmidt stammered, his voice thin and reedy. I was responding to an active anti-theft alarm. You were exiting the premises. The training parameters dictate an immediate investigatory detention to secure the scene." Terrell didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice. He simply began to dismantle the officer's reality with the cold precision of a legal scalpel. "The store security guard explicitly cleared me of any theft inside the premises," Terrell stated. "You did not verify that clearance. Therefore, you lacked reasonable articulable suspicion for the initial stop. When I provided visual confirmation of my receipt through the glass doors, you achieved your stated investigatory goal." Schmidt's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked desperately at Captain Harris, but the older man was staring fixedly at his desk blotter, completely abandoning his subordinate. "When you subsequently demanded physical possession of my property," Terrell continued, his voice dropping an octave, "you attempted to initiate a warrantless search without probable cause, consent, or exigent circumstances. And when I lawfully refused to surrender my Fourth Amendment rights," Terrell raised a single blood-stained hand, gesturing to the ruined front of his hoodie. "You shattered a glass jar against my chest, violently swept my legs, and drove your armored knee into my spine." "You were non-compliant," Schmidt blurted out, a desperate final surge of defensive panic breaking through his terror. "You refused a lawful order. I had to take control of the situation." "I complied with every lawful element of your demand, Officer Schmidt," Terrell said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet whisper that filled the entire office. "You didn't take control of a situation. You committed an aggravated battery under the color of law because your ego could not tolerate a citizen knowing their rights." The silence that followed was absolute. Terrell turned his back on the trembling patrolman and looked directly at Captain Harris. "Secure his body camera footage," Terrell commanded quietly, "and call the FBI field office. We are done here." 72 hours later, a windowless conference room inside the local FBI field office. Ryan Schmidt wore a stiff, poorly fitted gray suit. Stripped of his dark tactical uniform, his Kevlar vest, and his duty belt, he looked physically diminished. His union attorney sat beside him, nervously tapping a pen against a legal pad. 2 federal agents from the Civil Rights Division sat across the mahogany table. They didn't ask questions. The lead agent simply turned a silver laptop around and hit the space bar. The 4K Whole Foods security footage played in absolute silence. Camera 1 captured the interior. It clearly showed the store security guard smiling, making eye contact, and explicitly waving Terrell Brooks through the alarming gates. Any claim of probable cause evaporated instantly on the high-definition screen. Camera 2 captured the exterior vestibule. It showed Terrell calmly pressing the long thermal receipt against the glass, flawlessly fulfilling the investigatory demand without surrendering his physical property. Then, the video showed Schmidt slamming his hand against the glass, triggering the doors, and violently sweeping the legs of a compliant, middle-aged man into a puddle of shattered glass and marinara sauce. The federal agent paused the video, right as Schmidt's heavy knee dropped onto Terrell's spine. On the advice of counsel, Schmidt's attorney interrupted immediately, closing his legal pad. My client invokes his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. 6 months later, Federal District Court. Ryan Schmidt was permanently stripped of his badge and his qualified immunity. He stood before the judge's bench, his hands shackled at his waist, wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He had pled guilty to felony civil rights violations to avoid a longer trial. Seated in the first row of the gallery was Terrell Brooks. He wore a tailored black suit, a faint, perfectly healed white scar cut across his right cheekbone, a permanent physical record of the encounter in the parking lot. Terrell watched in absolute silence as the federal judge slammed the gavel, sentencing Schmidt to 48 months in a federal penitentiary. Schmidt turned as the U.S. Marshals grabbed his arms to lead him away. For one brief second, his eyes met Terrell's across the quiet courtroom. Terrell's expression didn't change. He simply gave a single, cold nod, stood up, and walked out the heavy wooden doors to return to his own courtroom. The takeaway here is brutal but simple. Your rights don't disappear just because an alarm beeps. Terrell won because he knew the law better than the man wearing the badge, and he let the cameras do the fighting for him. If you want to see more stories where knowing your rights actually destroys corrupt authority, drop a like and make sure to subscribe. And let me know down in the comments, what city are you watching from? And have you ever had a cop or security guard aggressively demand your receipt at the exit?
Case analysis finalized. To stay updated with transparent operations, please hit like and subscribe. Thank you for choosing Bodycam Incident Reports.